Anna from NHCSR here. It is wintertime and we are planning our research projects for the field season. I've also been spending a lot of time thinking abstractly about my career as somebody who's made a living asking questions about the biological world and writing about it. And something folks in my edge of the world tend to do a lot is coin terms, whimsical phrases that describe somewhat boring biological phenomena. We're always trying to make fetch happen.
You love him, and he totally complimented you. That is so fetch.
Gretchen, stop trying to make fetch happen.
And am I ever guilty of this? My career is littered with attempts to make fetch happen. Just in this paper alone, not only do I scold the reader for using the word repellent incorrectly, I name a new device the Hessler plate. It's really just a modified petri dish, but it was an elegant solution for something I was really struggling with in the lab, provided for me by a real hero in the scientific technician world, Stephen P. Hessler. One of my most prized possessions is a tea box he made for everybody in the lab for Christmas. I still have it. Most importantly in this paper, I attempt to define the term robust manipulations, and you will hear me talk about robust effects. So this term is really important for scenarios where there's definitely some kind of biological phenomena happening, but it's not robust enough to be considered for use in a pest management strategy. I'll give you an example. We've all heard recommendations to plant onions or garlic next to tomatoes. The idea is that the smell, the oniony smell of these plants will repel insect pests from your tomato plants or anything like that. And there definitely are deterrent effects from the odors coming from these plants. This has been well documented. This is true. However, the response is not robust enough to keep insects off of their host plant, these host plants that they need to survive. I urge you to think back about the last time you used a porta potty, the time you had to really go to the bathroom. It was pretty repellent, but did you go to the bathroom? All that to say, I love coming up with whimsical terms for concepts that probably don't really need them. And hang on to your butts because I have a plan for a study involving beans, my new passion, and it has a lot of whimsical terms. It has a lot of moving parts. We're really using every part of the buffalo on this one, so buckle up. Here's what I'm going to cover. I'm going to define some serious biological terms such as refugia, trap crop, sacrificial crop, supercharged trap crop, party zone, and Hail Mary crop, some of which are recognized by the scientific community, some of which I made up just now. I am going to talk a little bit about why beans are the coolest and discuss some of their crop and non-crop uses. I want to make the case for using beans for a behavioral control strategy that is using insect behavior as a strategy against them for pest management. And then finally, I will lay out the experiment that I would like to run this year. It's just an idea right now. I'm going to include what kind of measurements we'll be making and what I hope to learn from this. But there's still plenty of points where I need some input and some feedback and to think through some details. Let's start off with some non-crop uses for plants in our agro-ecosystems on our farms. A refugium is an area in which a population of organisms can survive through a period of unfavorable conditions. Now, in a farm setting, what we're really thinking about when we're thinking about unfavorable conditions is pesticide applications. We'll often encourage farmers to plant flowering plants in these little spots throughout the landscape because those flowering plants produce nectar and pollen that is beneficial for beneficial insects, parasitoid wasps, pollinating insects, bees, flies, all the good guys. I will point out that weed plants have flowers too. So what makes a weed? It's unwanted. Maybe you do want those in these weedy, crappy spots around the farm. Those are refugia. We can think of refugia as just spaces where we want to encourage insects to hang out. We want them to thrive. We want them to multiply. It's good for conservation, but it also could be good for biosystem services on the farm. Another example of encouraging insects to gather in discrete locations, the term Trap cropping is a time-tested behavioral control approach for pest management. And this is essentially growing something the insect prefers over your cash crop, planting it nearby in the hopes that you will intercept that insect pest on its way to your cash crop, stay on that trap crop, and avoid having to make any kind of action on the crop. We'll see some examples with using mustard greens to keep pests from going on broccoli. There's an example of plum curculio being trapped with plum trees so that they don't attack apple trees. Often these trap crops turn into what we call sacrificial crops because if they're doing their job right, they get overridden with pests. We really do recommend using a little bit of chemical control to manage these human-created aggregations. Otherwise, they'll spill over onto the neighboring crop, and you're right where you started. Or as I argue in my 2018 paper, we really should be using a more generic term, vicinity effects, so that we can distinguish between two distinct phenomena going on here. Maybe we don't need these extra terms, but I argued the case in this paper. Here we were looking at attract and kill with highly attractive insect lures. I argue that spillover effects are really a failure in controlling that aggregation. Insects come to a point source of odor, a lure that we put out there. The plant or wherever you are gets overcrowded, and the insects spill over to the cash crop, causing damage. Another separate term that we coin here is halo effects. This describes a situation where the insect never made it to that point source. We see this a lot with aggregation pheromones. They follow that odor plume to an attractive lure and they get distracted by all the delicious cash crops you've grown there, and they go, no, I'll just stop here. So a little bit different from spillover. Now, I failed to make fetch happen in that case. I don't think anybody really adopted my terminology, but folks investigating attract and kill in orchard systems certainly recognize this as a zone of aggregation. You can definitely see a clear benefit to the concept of applying pesticide to these discrete areas, often about the size of an apple tree, dotted around the perimeter of an orchard. So in lieu of spraying the whole orchard with a fine mist of toxicant, you just focus it on those small discrete areas. In this system, they're often referred to as a bomb tree. It's a term that I think may have been coined by Ron Prokope, who was a professor at the University of Massachusetts, but it was certainly popularized by Steve Wood, orchardist and bon vivant, who gives a rather graphic description as to what he'd like to do to the apple maggots that he traps in his orchard. I prefer the term party zone over zone of aggregation. I swear this is not a term that I made up. I'm pretty sure this might have come from Tracy Lesky, or it might have even been Rob Morrison, whose photo appears in the dictionary entry below straight shooter. My point here is that the term party zone is a very serious scientific term that is recognized by the scientific community. Yes, it is a fun term, but it implies a little bit more than the term zone of aggregation implies. We are creating aggregations, but also maybe we're doing some other stuff, right? A party zone implies multiple functions. This could be a hotspot for monitoring, so you could just go to the party zone to see what kind of bugs are there rather than walking a pattern through your field and looking at 20 plants. You could just go to the party zone and see who's here. The party zone could be where we do some of this nefarious stuff, do that chemical control that we talked about in this situation where we talked about the bomb tree. The party zone could also imply an aggregation of beneficial insects like we were talking about with refugia. I don't know, we'll see. Another term that we could use for this, synthetic insect pheromones used to create a party zone, is a term supercharged trap crop. Now, this term was coined by my colleague and best friend at the USDA research station down in Beltsville, Maryland, Don Weber. This term alludes to another term, supernormal stimulus, which was coined by really the OG of coining terminology and in ecology. And you know what? He actually did make fetch happen. This is a very famous term in ecology. So a supernormal stimulus is an exaggerated artificial response of natural cues that trigger stronger, often maladapted responses, more so than the natural stimuli observed. So in the case of herring gull chicks, this is really cute. Herring gull chicks will peck at a red spot on their parent's bill to elicit feeding. They found that these gull chicks prefer to stick with a red dot on it over an actual herring gull head when they were doing behavioral trials. This is because the chicks were targeting that red spot due to the contrast of color, and the dot on the stick was bigger than the dot on the gull head. Now, psychologists blame supernormal responses for our insatiable desire for sweeter, saltier junk food, bigger, faker boobs, beefier men. But the natural world is full of examples of supernormal stimulus that could be taken advantage of. There's tons of examples of animals exploiting other animals' supernormal stimulus. Granted, they do this through millions of years of evolution. We do this through chemical ecology. So Don Weber's idea around the supercharged trap, it followed a finding of his of a positive linear correlation between striped cucumber beetle and the concentration of a synthetic version of its aggregation pheromone, beta-lactone. This is an odor produced by the male cucumber beetle, but it attracts both males and females. We think it's the males that are out looking for host plants, and then everybody else will cue in to the odors of this happy, healthy male in order to find those host plants. It benefits everybody to show up. Now, it makes sense for other beetles to respond to the chemical equivalent of 1 or 2 or 5 males chemically calling to the rest of its conspecifics. But once you get up to 100 males worth, 1,000 males worth, these really high concentrations of this aggregation pheromone, you would think that something would kick in and they'd go, whoa, that's too many dudes. But no, there was no sign of a repellent effect, no matter how high the concentration was. So this is a stimulus that's ripe for exploitation, and John Weber has definitely been working on that. We'll come back to this when we get to the experiment. All right, so why beans? Why am I so obsessed with beans? Well, they're easy to grow. That's number one. But also, I've been reading a lot about all of the non-crop uses for legumes as a group. Non-crop uses that don't have anything to do with bugs. I am thinking about the critical role that legumes play in green manures. You can bring in all sorts of things bring them to the farm. We have synthetic fertilizers, organic meals and slurries, compost. These are all things that you bring into the farm to improve your soil. But the growers who really have their nitrogen needs locked down are the ones who grow their own nitrogen. So we know that legumes are famous for being nitrogen fixers. So with the help of some symbiotic bacteria, they basically snatch nitrogen out of the air and put it into the soil. So nitrogen that's just floating around free, put it in the soil rather than have to buy it in a bag. Leguminous crops like beans, like soybeans, they will often leave soil in better shape than they found it. And they call this a nitrogen credit. Or at the very least, these crops are not stripping the soil of nitrogen in the same way that other crops do. And you might be familiar with farm systems that rotate corn and soybeans. Corn, especially if it's harvested for silage, if you're taking the whole plant, those plants will strip nitrogen from the soil and the soybeans will put it back in. So you're alternating between corn and soybeans. Green manures are a little bit different. They are non-crop plants, usually a blend of grasses and a legume, usually like a clover or a vetch. These are grown and then tilled back into the soil. You're not harvesting and taking them anywhere. So those legumes are fixing nitrogen, but all that organic matter from the grasses and the legumes and all that organic matter breaks down and feeds the cash crop that you plant later on down the road. I want to play around with this a little bit. And I want to grow some legumes that you don't see too often in New Hampshire. And I'm thinking about edamame and peanut. And I'm coining a new term, Hail Mary crop. We all know that Hail Mary passes in football. It's a long, desperate pass thrown with very little chance of success, right? At the end of the game, you're praying for miraculous completion to win the game. I feel pretty confident that I can grow edamame here. They're literally just soybeans that you pick green. You don't let them dry down. You pick them green and you eat them kind of like a pea. If you haven't had edamame, they're kind of like a more firm, maybe sweeter pea. But the newer, sweeter varieties of edamame that have been bred specifically for picking green, they have a longer maturity. So more like 120 days compared to the 90 days that you would see with the normal soybean varieties. I am rather skeptical that my season is long enough for peanut, or at least not every year. Some years might be long enough, some years maybe not. But I'm making the argument here that something like peanut might have a place on northeastern farms, especially if we find other valuable uses for it. Maybe we can use these as party zones. We'll look at that. And hey, maybe the Hail Mary play of planting peanuts in New Hampshire, we don't get harvestable peanuts. Kind of like that Mitch Hedberg joke about how escalators can never break. They just turn into stairs. If you plant peanut and you don't harvest it, hey, congratulations, it's a green manure. So I want to know if I can create a party zone for a couple of different pests using these Hail Mary crops. I'm particularly interested in tarnished plant bug and striped cucumber beetle. Tarnished plant bug, it's adorable, but it is a serious pest of a ton of different crops. It's a true bug. It has piercing, sucking mouth parts. They have like a little straw for a mouth, and they poke into actively growing tissue, macerate that tissue, and suck out the goods, right? So the injury that results from that damage often happens as the plant grows around that damage, and you don't see it until later, but you'll see dimples, you'll see cat facing, you'll see distorted growth, weird fruit. This is a major pest for strawberry, cut flowers, apples, really important crops here in New Hampshire. And we're also talking to some entomologists at the University of Rhode Island about contributing to their work. They are investigating a parasitoid wasp that apparently was released as a biological control effort back in the 80s and 90s. They want to know if it's still here, so we'll be collecting some tarnished plant bug to contribute to their project. More on that later. Cucumber beetle, like its name implies, is a pest of cucumbers as well as its cousins, pumpkins, squash, melons. The adult beetle will eat up the leaves and do a number on small plants. Later on in the year, the adult feeding will also scar melon and pumpkin fruit, making them unmarketable. Also, and this impacts cucumber more than the other crops. Cucumber beetles transmit the pathogen responsible for wilts in this group. So, you may have been affected by this yourself. If you're growing a cucumber vine that's doing really well and you're watering it, there's no problems there, and it looks like it needs a drink of water, it looks wilted, sometimes that could be bacterial wilt. Brought to you by the cucumber beetles. Tarnished plant bug and cucumber beetle are not at all closely related, but they do share one thing in common, and that is that they love flowers. Well, the smell of flowers. Now, I'm not really sure how they feel about the flowers on legumes specifically. I need to do a little bit of research there. That also might be an element of our project this summer to figure out how they respond to those floral odors, but I do plan on supercharging this party zone with supplemental floral odors. Unfortunately, bees also like the smell of flowers, so since we're potentially up to some nefarious stuff down the road, not for this project, but for this kind of use, I am planning on including non-target insects in our plan for what data we will be measuring. Previous work has found that cucumber beetles were attracted to all the components of a commercial floral lure, but bees were attracted to all but one, indole. So we'll come to that later. All of these odors can be purchased as a lure. So we can set up small plots of peanuts or edamame and count how many insects visit the plots with and without these lures. All right, so the experiment. I will be setting up in a random block design with maybe 15 or 20 foot plots separated by 5 feet. I have yet to determine my varieties, but I will be going with an early maturing Spanish peanut variety. For the edamame, I'm really trying to get my hands on that Virginia sweet variety that was bred by Virginia Tech specifically for this. If I can't find that, I might be stuck with the more traditional soybean varieties, but stay tuned. Also, because these are Hail Mary crops, I am going to do this with as little input as possible. So no fertilizer, no irrigation. I do need to confer with my farm manager about how we are going to handle weed management. That's to be determined, but we're going to plant those seeds right in the ground and just see how they do. We'll be doing this with 2 different planting dates, so I have a couple wider windows to investigate insect attraction, to investigate how long this field season needs to be for these crops. So what are we going to measure? Germination. Having two different planting dates will give us some opportunity to have variation in soil temperature. So that will certainly impact germination, and it may also impact the success or failure of those fungal pathogens that tend to thrive in cooler soil. So we'll look at damping off rates. We're also going to measure time to flower, comparing those planting dates. I know that tarnished plant bug will certainly be attracted to these crops, but I don't know what to expect with cucumber beetle. I think that's going to be something that we'll learn here. And if the timing of when they are looking for their hosts and the timing of the flowering is well aligned, that could be a really powerful signal. I'm going to deploy these indole lures in half of the plots so I can compare and contrast how attractive peanut is with or without the additional supercharged floral component. How we'll do that is just measure how many insects are on those plots with and without the lure. I would like to do this while the plants are not flowering, and then again when the plants are flowering, so we can perhaps tease apart the interaction between the synthetic lure and the naturally occurring floral odors that come from the pea flowers. How are we going to make our observations? So we certainly could do this with traps. We could use sticky traps. We could use vacuum sampling. That might mess up the plants a little bit. So I think we'll probably go for good old-fashioned timed observations. Think setting out with a lawn chair and just looking to see who comes to these plants. Essentially, we set a timer. I usually use a Tabata timer that people use for HIIT exercises. We look at the undersides of leaves, the base of the plant for the herbivores. We'll likely see some other insects flying around. I think for the bees, we'll probably only count them if they land on the plant. There's going to be some stuff flying around. I need to think about that a little bit. And finally, if we're lucky, if our prayers pay off for us, we'll measure yield. So we can clip edamame pods and weigh them to estimate pounds per row foot. For the peanuts, they do have to be dug up and they do have to dry a little bit before you clip them off of the plants. So we may have to cross that bridge when we get to it. They may not make it, but I think being able to harvest any amount of peanuts is going to be a success here. And because we do have a deadline, we only have this land for the season, we will likely not be able to measure the long-term impacts of growing these crops on soil health over time. However, we could do some kind of assessment of biomass at the end of the season. I need to talk to an expert in green manures to see if I can get some advice on that, but plenty more to think about as I pick up more input. So let me know what you think. Is this silly? Would you like an excuse to grow peanuts? Reach out. Let me know more about this. Are you as excited about beans as I am writ large? They sound really easy and they have relatively few pests. Let me know. All right. Thanks for listening.